I'm Louise D'Arcens. I was speaking about the film The Name of the Rose. My paper was called Mirthful Faces in The Name of the Rose, and it was about the film and the book The Name of the Rose, and it was for this Collaboratory on Faces of Emotion. And so I was looking particularly at the way in which the novel and the film represent comedy and humour, and in particular the way that's focalised through smiling and laughing faces throughout the film. I guess what I was looking at was in particular how it was that Umberto Eco in the first instance with the novel chose to represent the Middle Ages. And his decision in the novel, or one of the decisions that he made, was to represent a Middle Ages in which there was a pretty fierce set of inquiries and kind of dissent around the question of humour, and in particular whether humour is something that can ultimately question the existence of God and make us no longer fear God. And so he sets it in a monastic community and has this kind of Franciscan come in, and this Franciscan figure, William of Baskerville, represents this kind of comic impulse in society, and he's a very confronting figure to that community for all kinds of reasons, but that's certainly one of them. When the filmmaker Jean-Jacques Arnaud came to make a film of the book, he had to make all sorts of aesthetic decisions about how he'd represent this whole debate around comedy and humour. And in the paper, I was looking in particular about the way he used actors and the faces of actors as a way of signifying certain forms of humour, but also as faces that represented some kind of idea we have today of the Middle Ages. And so he chose all of these very grotesque actors basically to represent some sort of Gothic idea that we have about this very forbidding, mysterious, grotesque Middle Ages. So. It's such a vast question, the question of the history of emotions. I'm really enjoying this symposium because in some ways focusing on the face gives us a really manageable sort of focus for this question that can sometimes feel so unwieldy and kind of endlessly, growing that the face just gives us a way of just focusing the question down onto something that, again, we take for granted. I love it when research gives you something that you take for granted in a daily kind of a way and makes it strange for you and makes you think about it as, when you think of your face, well, it's the most kind of, you've got it every day. It's just part of life. It's, not something you ask many questions about, I suppose. And then you have a symposium like this that makes you think, hang on, it hasn't always been this way. People thought about faces in this way. This is what they thought the face did. This is what they thought expression was, communication was, and how do we then understand that today? I think I'm, a really big believer in that kind of reflective process, and so the conference has been really great for drawing that out for me. So the paper that I was doing on The Name of the Rose is part of this larger project that I'm working on. I'll be working on that over the next few years as part of an ARC Future Fellowship. And that's called Laughing at the Middle Ages, that larger project. And it's a long historical project, so it's going from, really the late 15th century or 16th century through till today, and that's kind of dauntingly large. But in terms of the kind of quite contemporary content, what I've been doing with some of the stuff that I've been looking at is having a look at particularly, say, things like political debates or kind of cultural debates or moments of cultural reflection, and seeing the way the Middle Ages actually figures within those. So say, for instance, one of the kind of, I suppose, public conversations that continually go on are around the role of technology and the fact that communication technology is developing at this pace that nobody can, keep up with or fully understand, as it unfolds. And it's really interesting the way the medieval period, and particularly monastic culture as sort of a place where book production took place, pops up as this kind of point of, not even ridicule, but a kind of a point of history that people use to reflect on our ideas about technology. So there are these, fantastic cartoons that I've come across, and also brilliant skits from various television shows where there'll be, they'll focus on a monk who is, freaking out at, this thing called a book. I mean, you know, what happened to codexes? What happened to rolls? How do you even work this thing? And they had to have a tech guy come in and, you know, and who's another monk, sort of show him how to use it. It's a way of us kind of thinking about what technology means to us by looking back to a culture that we, on the one hand, perceive as sort of frozen in time, anti-technological, atechnological, non-progressive, etc., but also one in which there were actually really significant milestones of the recording and the communication of information. One of the things that many people who work in the field of medievalism studies would agree on is that when we look to the Middle Ages, it's almost always, even if this is not what we principally set out to do, it is always telling us about ourselves, because the way we think through modernity and progress and the future is by looking at the past. And the Middle Ages operates as this period that we often feel we've superseded, we've gone beyond it, or we on other occasions see it as the origin of who we are. And I think Australian culture, you know, the signs of that engagement with that deep past are around us all the time. Australian literature has just oodles of medievalism right through it. Our public buildings are medievalist, many of them are medievalist. Australians today continue to engage in all sorts of really interesting, well, reenactments, I suppose, you know, of the Middle Ages. And a lot of our public entertainment engaged, particularly in the 19th century, very strongly with the Middle Ages. It haunts us. It's just once you become sensitised to finding them, you see it everywhere, and you realise that this period has actually had a really significant role, particularly in the colonial period of Australia, in developing a sense of who we think we are nationally. There's been some really, really great work done by some of my colleagues. I've done a little bit myself, but colleagues all over the place on nostalgia, for instance, and they'll look at how, you know, when we look to the past, to the medieval past, it evokes quite powerful emotional attachments to do with what we think we've lost, you know, a world that, you know, had all of these ideals that have now sort of been crushed under modernity, etc. And I guess in some respects, I love that work, but I feel as though what needs to come along with that is also the kind of amusement and the joy and the pleasure and the fun that we find in the past as well. And the fact that going back to the past gives us an enormous sense of pleasurable connection, not just a sense of loss, but a sense of connection.